Hi, I'm Rachel Lopez. I'm the archivist and the librarian. And before I introduce Julianne, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Siegler Fellowship, which is part of what made tonight possible. The Siegler Fellowship was created in honor of Alabama Holocaust survivor Ruth Siegler, who many of you may know. Her family worked with BHEC to create this research fellowship opportunity for students to ensure that stories of the Holocaust would be preserved for future generations. So for 2019, the Siegler Fellowship was awarded to Julianne Jorgensen. She will be graduating from Samford this spring with a double major in English and Classics. Julianne has spent countless hours researching the remarkable life and legacy of Aisic Hirsch. Julianne has researched all kinds of archival material, including Aisic's own words and testimonies. And quickly, I'd like to extend a welcome to Reva Hirsch, Aisic's wife, and many other family members. It sounds like children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So welcome. And I'll now, briefly, before Julianne begins, I want us all to remember that her work is a living document, and we hope to continue to learn more about the life of Aisic Hirsch and continue building our knowledge. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Julianne.
Hello, everyone. As Rachel said, my name is Julianne Jorgensen, and I am honored and humbled to be in front of you all today to present on Aisic Hirsch. Unfortunately, I never got to meet Aisic in person, but I do feel like I know him very well after studying his life and learning about his character and his joy in the face of the hardships that he went through. So thank you all for being here. I know many of you did know Aisic, and I know you loved him dearly, and I'm excited to honor him tonight. And for those of you who have not had the privilege of meeting Aisic, I hope you will get to know him throughout this hour as we learn more about him. So Aisic was born on August 15th, 1930, and he was born to his two parents, Reva and Chaim. And this is Aisic's family tree, actually. We're able to trace it all the way back to his great-grandfather, Wolf Bear Hirsch. And Wolf Bear Hirsch had four sons, Jacob, Nathan, Joseph, and Yitzhak. And now Yitzhak was Aisic's grandfather and his namesake, as we can see. Now Yitzhak had Chaim, and then Chaim married Reva Goldberg, and then had Aisic and his younger brother Samuel, or Shmuel. This is also important to note his family background because Aisic's relative Max Hirsch and Sylvia Charon and their daughter Betty Hirsch, now Betty Lancer, wrote the recommendations for Aisic Hirsch and his family to come to America. So we'll get to that later, but that is just important to know that this whole family tree is responsible for Aisic's survival.
And he was the lucky one. He died on his own bed.
So I don't know if you could hear what Aisic just said in this, but he is talking about his father, Chaim. And Chaim died in 1938. He was working in a tannery factory in Aisic's hometown. And for those of you who do not know, a tannery factory is a leather working factory. And Aisic's dad worked there making shoes with the leather. Now, when you're making shoes, you had to soak the leather in these vats of water to make them pliable. And Aisic's father actually fell into one of these vats, and he became very, very sick. He came down with a sickness so badly that he was coughing up blood, and he had to retire from this position. But he slowly recovered, and he knew he had to provide for his family. So he opened up a saloon. And this was a place where the men of the town could come and play cards and dominoes while maybe having a cold beer. And Aisic has memories of going to this saloon and watching his father and other men playing dominoes while he's standing by seeing what's happening. So in this quote, Aisic is saying that his father was the lucky one because he was able to die before the war started and before all of the atrocities that Aisic and his mother and grandmother and brother had to go through. So Aisic grew up in Poland, and we see that Poland is smushed in between Germany and Russia, which will come into play later. He grew up in a town called Mogielnica, which was quite close to Warsaw, where Aisic will eventually be in the ghetto. Now there's multiple spellings for Mogielnica, so while I was researching this, we had to see and make sure, are these the same towns? And they are. So that was one of our obstacles that we were going through while researching Aisic's life. These are images of Mogielnica right before World War II, and this would have been what Aisic would see on a regular basis as a child growing up. This is the marketplace, and one other image of the marketplace that Aisic would have been walking around with his family, shopping on a regular basis. There was a large Jewish community in Mogielnica, and they had 2 synagogues in this town. Now, this is just one of the synagogues. It's just 2 images from different angles of the same building. And Aisic remembers running around the synagogue as a child. We're not sure if this was the synagogue or if it was the other one that we do not have documentation of, but this very well could be the synagogue he remembers running around. This is the interior of that synagogue, and we see the beautiful detailing of this wooden structure. And this is the same interior, just a different angle. And if you can notice this beautiful working up in the ceiling, showing the intricate woodwork that went into these synagogues. And Poland was very famous for these wooden synagogues. And unfortunately, that meant that they were very easy to burn, especially when the Germans entered. That was immediately what happened. So Aisic grew up attending Jewish school known as Heder. Now, his family raised him to attend this school in the afternoons, but they were not an overtly Orthodox family. They did celebrate the holidays, and Aisic remembers that time with a fondness. He specifically remembers having to wear his white holiday clothing, and he really struggled to keep it clean for his mom. He often got in trouble for that as a young child. So Aisic's childhood was very similar to what children today experience in the States. He remembers it being relatively happy before the war started. These are images from our Darkness into Life program, and these are acrylic paintings depicting Aisic as a child. So he would go to school in the mornings, and he would walk half a mile to get to school. And at this school, we had Polish children and Jewish children together. And then in the evenings, he would go to Jewish school and learn Hebrew and learn about the Jewish customs and traditions. But Aisic did not just play or did not just learn and focus on academics. He was a great soccer player, and he was quite avid about this. He became quite popular because he was so skilled on the field. And his position was goalie. He remembers that specifically. Now, this image is perhaps my favorite in the whole slideshow because it is a miracle that we have it. This is Aisic as a young boy. It is the only documentation that we have of Aisic's childhood. And what's amazing is we can see Aisic's fair hair and also his blue eyes that later darkened into his adulthood. So growing up as a Jew in the 1930s wasn't easy. Although Aisic did say he does remember his childhood with fond memories, there were moments when he experienced hardship because of the anti-Semitism in Mogielnica. This next clip that we're about to see is Aisic himself speaking. This clip is pulled from his 1996 interview, his Shoah interview for Steven Spielberg. So we'll be looking throughout the evening at clips of this, as well as another clip from 2011 where he's speaking at a lecture for the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center.
Do you remember experiencing any kind of anti-Semitism while you were
Yes.
a child?
So if you couldn't hear, I'll recap it for you. He is being asked by the interviewer whether or not he remembers experiencing anti-Semitism as a child. And Aisic doesn't even let the interviewer finish his question because he knows the answer right off the tip of his tongue. It was an immediate yes. So Aisic particularly remembers experiencing this during holiday seasons when he would be walking to school and the Polish children would throw rocks at the Jewish children and yell at them that they killed children and drained their blood to make their matzo balls. So this was what Aisic experienced as a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old child.
You know, kids like me, we were used to this abuse, you know, from the Polish kids. It was nothing, you know. It's just sometimes you fought back and sometimes you just stood away from it.
So Aisic experienced this daily, and that was a part of his childhood that stains these memories and shows the hardship that he experienced even before war broke out. Now, eventually, war did come, and the Germans enter Poland on September 8th, 1939. And when they entered Poland, they were finishing up a plan that was made by Hitler called the Fall Weiss, which is translated to be the case white. And Hitler orchestrated this whole plan to overtake Poland as quickly and as effectively as possible. And it was quick. By September 27th or 28th, it depends on exactly where you were within Poland, the whole country had surrendered to German rule. And these images are really important. They are not images of Mogielnica specifically, but they're images of the Germans riding tanks and bikes into the towns. And this is exactly what Aisic saw when the Germans entered Mogielnica. So the Germans came in on a Thursday into Mogielnica, and they entered on these motorcycles and these tanks. And one awful part of this story is that they came in throwing chocolate candy at the children. So as a young child, Aisic was very confused. Who are these people? They're giving me candy, so this seems like a good thing. But then only 2 hours later, a fire was coming up at the other end of town, and the synagogues were in flames. A couple of days later, they dragged out the Hasidim and the 2 rabbis into that marketplace that we saw pictures of earlier. And there they were humiliated, their beards were cut, they were mocked and abused and whipped, and the 2 rabbis were murdered and hung in the marketplace for all to see. And just a few days later, Aisic was no longer allowed to go to school. All of the Jewish children were not permitted to enter the schools at this point. So this next clip we're going to see and hopefully hear if you listen closely. We're sorry about the sound being a little bit quieter, but Aisic is describing what he remembers on that Saturday when they dragged out the Hasidim and the rabbis.
And you know, this is in my mind a picture that's never going to go out. All the Polish people around, maybe not all of them, but most of them were clapping. And they were over there, thousands of Polacks around. You could see how deep the anti-Semitism was from those people. And probably the bad people came out over there, and not the good ones. To see how they killed 2 rabbis, hang him on poles in middle of the market, beaten the Hasidim, you know, the followers, which were maybe 30, 40 of them, cutting off the beards. And this was a horrible thing, and I'm never going to forget it.
So as a 9-year-old, Aisic experienced this, and if it was hard for you to hear, what he is saying is he remembers seeing a group of Polish people standing around while these Hasidim and these rabbis were being abused and mocked, and he remembers them clapping. This next image shows us what would have been happening in the marketplace. This is not Mogielnica itself, but this is a very similar situation that happened all across Poland as the Germans entered the cities. Here is another image that is particularly disturbing, as we can see the smiles behind on the German officers' faces.
What did you do?
What could I do? I just went home again running and telling my mother. That's what I did.
What happened?
I couldn't help nothing.
So imagine the despair Aisic must have felt as a child who could do nothing to prevent these Germans and the atrocities that they were doing to the people in his hometown. He felt helpless and confused and lost. And soon after the Germans entered, they established the Judenrat in 1939, at the end of the 1939. And the Judenrat, for those who don't know, were Jews that were put into power in order to run the Jewish community, and they were placed in power by the Germans. So essentially these Jewish leaders became puppets inflicting and putting into place the German orders. So after the Judenrat was established, the ghetto came up quickly after that, towards the end of 1939, beginning of 1940. And Aisic was there with his mother, his brother, and his grandmother for about 2 to 3 months. So just to remind us where we are, this is where Mogielnica is. And at this point, late 1939, a huge deportation of Jews came from Lodz, and they came because the Lodz Ghetto had not been established yet. That was established in February of 1940. So the location of the Mogielnica Ghetto was about 10 to 20 streets, and Aisic and his family actually already lived within the jurisdiction that became the ghetto. Now, there were 4 people in a 1-person bedroom at the beginning, but then once the ghetto was established, 10 more people were added into this apartment. So people were living on top of one another. Aisic also remembers that food was extremely scarce at this point. You had to wisely ration out the food because you could only get food at a certain location within the ghetto, and only if you were lucky enough to be at the front of the line, which very few were. Mogielnica Ghetto had a very strict curfew. The ghetto was open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., but if you were caught outside of the ghetto at past 7, you were shot on sight. It didn't matter if you were a man, woman, or a child. So Aisic does remember waking up every morning and seeing fresh bodies on the ground for those who were left and did not come back in time. This next image shows children on the street. This is actually in Warsaw Ghetto, but it shows what Aisic would have been doing within the Mogielnica Ghetto himself. Aisic was now the head of the household after his father, Chaim, had died, so he was trying to provide for his family. So he tried to sell cigarettes on the side of the street in order to gain a little bit of money for his mom and his grandmother and his brother.
And they were, I heard they were saying, we're going to Warsaw. We're going to Warsaw. This is a better place.
Had you heard anything more about the war, or anything that was going on in the meantime?
My goal was, to stay alive. I didn't know what's going on. As a kid, I was hiding behind my mom's skirt, What did I know?
So rumors had started to go around that the Jews in the Mogielnica Ghetto were going to be going to a better place. And as a Jew in the ghetto, your information was quite limited, and only the information that you were getting was from the Germans. So they were telling these things about, a better place that you will be sent to. And not knowing what to do, they were hopeful maybe they were going to a better place. But unfortunately, that was not the case, and the Jews in the Mogielnica Ghetto were deported to Warsaw Ghetto. And Aisic, as well as his mother, his brother, and his grandmother, all were deported to Warsaw Ghetto. But those who were left behind in the Mogielnica Ghetto were sent to Sosnowiec Ghetto for a temporary holding place, just for a short amount of time, and then these Jews were deported to Auschwitz and sent out from there. So Aisic escaped Auschwitz, but he ended up in Warsaw Ghetto. And the trip was not long. As we remember, Mogielnica was not far from Warsaw, but they were packed into cattle cars on the train, about 50 to 60 people in the cattle cars. And he remembers it being horrifying, terrible, cramped, and as we can imagine, these people have not had much health care provided for them, so sickness is also running rampant at this time. So they arrived in Warsaw Ghetto, and here we can see how close Mogielnica was to Warsaw. And Mogielnica Ghetto was not the only ghetto that was being deported into Warsaw. We have numerous other ghettos coming in to this small space within Warsaw. And just for us to keep this in mind, Warsaw was the second largest Jewish community center in the world, second to New York City. So we have a huge amount of Jews within this tiny space in Warsaw. So a little bit of background on the Warsaw Ghetto. Similar to Mogielnica, the Judenrat was established in 1939. And at this point, they start hearing rumors that a ghetto might be forming. But these rumors are quickly squashed down, only to be confirmed in 1940, about a year later, on October 3rd. This date is particularly important because it was the night before Rosh Hashanah, so you know that this must have been purposeful on the Germans' part in order to start this ghetto, this horrible place, right before this holiday. Later on, we get the ghetto sealed on November 16th, and that's when Jewish police start to run the ghetto. In 1940, we get the first death penalty given to men and women that had tried to attempt to escape over the ghetto walls. And in 1942, the violence is just increasing steadily as we have the Night of Blood and 52 people are murdered. And in July, 100 Jews are murdered. And then by the middle of 1942, we're starting to have large deportations to Treblinka. Now, it's important to understand where exactly Aisic is falling into this timeline. Aisic most likely would have arrived to the Warsaw Ghetto at this point in 1940, between the establishment and the sealing of the ghetto. And most likely he escaped the Warsaw Ghetto at this point, right before the liquidation and the deportations to Treblinka would have started. This is an image of Warsaw Ghetto, these walls being built. They were 3 meters high, and once they were finished, they would have glass and barbed wire put on the top so no escaping could be made over the top of these. And if you look closely, you can see the ragged edges of the glass. This is another image just depicting the walls. And here we see an entrance gate into the ghetto right here. The ghetto also had one footbridge that crossed over, connecting ghetto on the left to ghetto on the right. And this would have been a free street that they're crossing over. And we can also see the armbands on the Jews on top of this bridge. Now, as you can imagine, this was a place of complete despair and hopelessness. But in order to encourage one another and boost morale, they did create this song of the Warsaw Ghetto that we still have preserved for us today. And it says, "Oh, never say that you have reached the very end, though leaden skies a bitter future may portend, because the hour for which we yearned will yet arrive, and our marching steps will thunder, we survive." And Aisic did survive. So this song is a testament to that. So as we saw from that map of all the deportations coming into Warsaw Ghetto, we see how many Jews were put into this place. 30% of Warsaw's population was concentrated into about 2.4% of the city's territory. This next map shows deportations from Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, but it's particularly helpful for us to understand the geography of the ghetto. There were 3 sections: Central Ghetto in the north that housed the Judenrat, the railroad, and the police. And we see this railroad right up here in the northernmost part. It headed straight to Treblinka. So when deportations began, Jews were shuffled this way, shoved onto the cattle cars, and deported right to Treblinka. In the north portion, the central portion, we also see that it's connected to the Jewish cemetery. And then the second portion was the productive ghetto. And the third portion was the brushmakers district, where they literally did, the Jews were forced to make brushes for the Germans. Now there's a fourth area of the ghetto that's not an official designation, but it was called the Wild Ghetto, and it was in between Central Ghetto and the Productive Ghetto. And it was one of the most dangerous areas of Warsaw Ghetto at this point. Everyone tried to avoid it. And one last important thing from this image, this map, is we see that footbridge that we just saw would have been right here, connecting these 2 portions, the northern portion and the southern portion. This is the Judenrat building taken after the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the ghetto truly became like a labor camp. As we mentioned, the brushmakers' districts, the Jews were being forced into labor. And in this image, we see men and women at sewing machines. And we also see the Star of David on their arm. I pulled this image from the Warsaw Ghetto specifically to show how many people were forced into this tiny space. You see so many right below here, and you also can see the destruction that was going on within this space. Aisic lived on the first floor of one apartment building, and there were about 5,000 to 6,000 people in one apartment building. So Aisic again remembers people on top of people. They slept on army beds and had extreme limitations on food. They were given 1 bowl of soup per day, but it was mostly water. They were given 1/4 of a loaf of bread and a little bit of drinking water. Another pamphlet said that they were given 1 pound of bread per person per week. So these were very meager rations, and again, like Mogielnica, they were only gained if you stood in line early and were there all day, and you weren't being forced to do labor. So because food was so scarce, smuggling became a big part of the Warsaw Ghetto. People were desperate, and so they risked their lives in order to get food or the chance of getting food. So one way that they tried to do this was going over the walls. Now this was the most obvious way and most conspicuous, so it was the most dangerous way, and it was quite easy to be shot for this. So, in order to avoid being seen, children were used to smuggle food in. They often would escape in the bottom of the walls. There would be small holes that they could fit through, and only a child could fit through these spaces. We see here an image of a child coming through the wall. Now, Aisic did not smuggle. He did beg. So like these children, he would have been seen sitting on the side of the road begging for food and trying to get what he could for his family. This next clip is Aisic describing that time.
And I would go out sometimes from this building. They let you out, but it was still ghetto. It was the same ghetto, you know. And I would go around with kids, and
It's all right.
and beg.
So this just shows the despair that a 9-year-old boy would have felt in the fact that he could not feed his family, he could not help his mother, his grandmother, and his brother. As we have mentioned, disease was running rampant throughout the ghetto. People are living on top of people, so you can imagine how disease would have spread so quickly. And typhus was a huge killer at this point. So we see this is a graph just of 1941 of the typhus spread. And this was actually preserved for us through the Oneg Shabbat, which was the Warsaw Underground Archives. So people preserved these documents so that we later on could know what they went through. Because typhus was running so quickly throughout the ghetto, they would try to quarantine those who had it. And this sign says, "Typhus, strictly forbidden to enter or leave." They would even have officers guarding these areas where those who were sick were quarantined so that no one could get in or out. This is a chart of deaths in Warsaw, including those who died from typhus or malnutrition or malaria or any other cause of death. And we can see this just goes from January to August, and the numbers are staggering, just in 1 year. Now, a part of these numbers were Aisic's grandmother and his brother. This report here is a report that Aisic submitted in 1955 to Yad Vashem, and it's a report stating how his brother Samuel was murdered and died in Warsaw Ghetto. Most likely he had a high fever, so we think that it was most likely typhus that killed him.
Now let me tell you about Warsaw. In my opinion, Warsaw Ghetto was hell on earth worse than a concentration camp. Why? People were laying dead in the street. My eyes saw people today, and 3 days later the same people laying dead. Nobody picked up those people. The smell of flesh was horrible.
So this is Isaac's remembering. There were so many who were sick and dying from these diseases that there wasn't enough time to bury them all separately. So they would often have to use mass graves in order to bury all of the bodies. And their goal was to quarantine all of the sickness, so they would burn the clothing in an effort to limit the amounts of sickness. So after the death of Isaac's brother and grandmother, it was just Isaac and his mother left alone in Warsaw Ghetto. And Isaac had to have one of the most difficult conversations he most likely ever had with his mother at this point.
Then my mother said to me, I want you to run away from all this. Maybe, just maybe, with God's help, you're gonna survive. In the beginning, it shocked me. Well, I'm gonna run away from my mother? How can I do a thing like this? Mom, what are you doing? No, she says. They all gonna finish us off here, sooner or later. Maybe just you're gonna survive.
So Isaac's mom decides to make the greatest sacrifice that a mother could make for her child. She sends him away to be left alone in the Warsaw Ghetto so that he could survive and tell his story. And he did. And thanks to her sacrifice, we still have Isaac's memories and his stories today. But those who were left behind in Warsaw and who did not escape were sent from Warsaw straight to Treblinka, which, if you do not know what Treblinka was, it was solely a death camp. So when you entered there, the purpose was to be exterminated. This is a map of Treblinka, and we see the quadrant of the death camp is so much larger than the living camp. And the only people who would be in the living camp would be the Germans in charge of Treblinka and the few Jews that were chosen to clean up the bodies and what was the remains. After the Germans had used Treblinka for their purpose, they had gotten rid of all that they needed to, they quickly broke down Treblinka. And all that is left is we see the railroad and a field. But thankfully, Isaac escaped this fate because of his mother's sacrifice. Now at Treblinka, there are memorials of towns who lost their Jewish community and whose whole Jewish community was completely wiped out. And Mogielnica was one of them. So this is all that remains of Isaac's home. Now there were still some Jews that were left in Warsaw Ghetto, and those who were left were quickly hunted out and smoked out by the Germans. And we have images of what happened to these Jews from the Stroop report that was completed by General Stroop as he was documenting the process of liquidation for Warsaw Ghetto. So we are thankful for this because we are able to see these images of Warsaw Ghetto and know what was going on towards the end of the liquidation. So we can see the fires, we see some of the Jews who were trying to escape had been killed. We see all of these images of complete destruction and despair at the end of the Warsaw Ghetto. But Isaac escaped all of this. And he escaped all of this through an organization called Save the Children. This was how Aisic remembers this organization, through the name Save the Children. But we do wonder if it was also the organization called Zgoda, which was an organization specifically used in Warsaw Ghetto to help children escape and find ways out. We're not completely sure if it was Zgoda, but we know that an organization helped Aisic escape. And they did so by paying off German guards, and then the children would run through the walls and run away as fast as they can. Aisic remembers that he left with about 40 or 50 children, and he doesn't remember any of them because he decided, I'm just going to run as fast as I can so that I may possibly survive. 80% of Aisic's group were caught, even though those German guards were bribed. And sometimes Polish people would have caught them, the locals, and would have given them back to the Germans just for a liter of vodka. Children also would escape through the drains because of their small size.
Maybe somebody up there wanted me to survive.
And he did. So what he did was, he's a young child. He's about 10 or 11 years old at this point. And where would he go? He has no idea. He has to make these huge decisions completely on his own, completely isolated. So this is a part of Aisic's story that gets a little bit more complicated with the order of where he goes next. We know that he mentions going to a small village called Nowy Miasto, which was where a Jewish organization helped him and helped children. And we think at this point that he meets someone who he knew at Mogielnica, and this person who he knew from Mogielnica knew a way back into the Warsaw Ghetto. And so he went back to the ghetto in order to find out about his mother and what happened to him, or what happened to his mother, excuse me. So they sneak back into the Warsaw Ghetto, and at one point he sees on the street a relative of his, and this relative tells him, your mother, she's no longer here. She was sent to a hospital within the Warsaw Ghetto, and she unfortunately lost her mental capabilities and passed away. So again, in the same report that Aisic filled out for his younger brother, he also recorded his mother's death. Now Aisic's next place that we think he went is Mogielnica. We know that he went to Mogielnica and he went to Nowy Miasto, but the order is somewhat unsure. But we know that he goes to Mogielnica because he's walking down the street trying to decide where to go next. And he meets a man on the street and he says, which way is Mogielnica? Because like any young child, he wants to go home. And by providence, he was walking in the direction of Mogielnica. So Aisic continues to walk for 3 days and 3 nights. Every time he would see a car, he would hide because he knew that that was extremely dangerous for him to get caught. And eventually he makes it to Mogielnica. And he goes to one of his father's friends, Stasik Colton. Now, when he knocks on the door, Stasik opens it up and is amazed to see Aisic still alive. And he says, okay, I'll help you, but you cannot stay in my home. You have to go into the cemetery, and I can bring you food from there, but I can't endanger my family by having you inside my house. So Aisic goes to the cemetery, and this is the Jewish cemetery that he stays in. And actually, this is the same cemetery where his father was buried in 1938. This is all that remains of it now because most Jewish cemeteries, as the Germans came through, were demolished and destroyed. So Aisic stayed in the cemetery, and Stasik's son brought him food at night. Aisic stayed there for actually about a month, but towards the end of this month, he started to get a weird feeling about Stasik's son, and he decides, okay, I'm not going to be where he thinks I'm going to be this time when he comes and brings me food. I'm going to hide in the tree and look and see what happens. And so up in the tree, he hears someone coming, and it isn't Stasik's son. They are German officers carrying rifles, and they're searching for Aisic. And they come into the cemetery, and they see a shallow grave, and they just start shooting, thinking he must be in here. And by chance and by miracle, they don't check to make sure he was there. They leave quickly, and they also miraculously did not bring any dogs with them, which is a small detail, but if they had brought dogs, they would have sniffed Aisic and would have caught him in the tree, and we wouldn't have Aisic here in his story here with us today. So Isaac's reasonings were right. He knew something was wrong, and he acted on them. And we're so thankful that he did. So he flees the cemetery and goes to another friend of his father whose name is Vladek. Similar to Stasik, he says, I can help you, but I cannot keep you in my house, so you can stay in my barn. And there, Vladek brings him food, and Isaac actually got sick during this time, and Vladek cared for him and helped him and nursed him back to health. Vladek also helped Isaac by giving him a Catholic catechism book, and he said, memorize this. And Isaac did. He spent his time in the barn memorizing all of these prayers and recitations, and it comes to later save his life. But about a month into being at the barn, Isaac decides it's probably time for me to move locations. He can't stay in one place for too long. So he starts wandering, and he has an aunt in northern Poland, so he thinks, maybe I'll try to go see if she's still around, if I can find her. But eventually he actually hits this town named Goshen. Now, in this town, he enters it on a Sunday morning, and he doesn't really see many people about. And so he thinks to himself, what would a good Catholic boy be doing at this point? Because I can't be Jewish, or else I'll be caught. So he realizes, I would be in church. So he goes into the church that is right there. This is St. Michael the Archangel. And this picture was actually taken in probably around the 1930s. But the church still stands today, and you can go visit the church that Isaac went into this Sunday morning. And when Isaac goes in there, he knows the prayers, he knows his recitations because of this catechism book and because of what Vladek did for him. So in the church, we were able to find that there were 2 priests that would have been serving in the church at the time that Isaac was there. And we were able to do this because we knew it was St. Michael the Archangel, and when we were able to narrow it down from the time period and see that these were the 2 priests serving it. Now this priest, we do not know his name, but we do know the name of the second priest, Hilary Yastik. Now Isaac recognized this first image, the image of the first priest, but we think that this was the priest that helped Isaac in this church was Hilary Yastik, which we will get to in a moment. But first we'll hear Isaac's own experience of entering this church.
I know, you know what to say before confession and after confession. I learned it in the book. So I stay alive. My time comes. Everything comes back. And the priest, when I came, I'm saying my prayer, he probably detected that I'm not just from here, that I might be Jewish, because I start crying. I never cried in my life. I start crying. He realized that I must be Jewish, because he took out his hand and put on my head, and he told me, don't cry. You don't have to say nothing. Someday your father and mother, your family going to come back, and you come back to them, and you see, with God's help, you'll be all right.
So Isaac was told by this priest when he goes up for confession, come and meet me in my office, and I will help you. So Isaac has to make a choice. Do I trust this man? Can I trust this man? What should I do? And as we saw with Isaac in the cemetery, his feelings are usually correct. So he decides, I'm going to trust this man. And he goes and meets him in his office. And there the priest gives Isaac a new name, a new identity, a new background, as well as false documents so that he could find a new place to live. Now we think that this priest that helped him was Hilary Yastik because Yastik was a part of the Polish Home Army. So he would have had connections in order to give Isaac those false documents. But Isaac's new name was no longer Aisic Hirsch, but it was Bronislaw Porczynski, a very Polish name. And Aisic was also given a new identity and these false documents. And he was placed with a family on a farm. Now, this farm was not in Goshen exactly. It was in a neighboring town, village right nearby called Brunichev. And he was there with the Frigis family. And what is amazing about this, and what is so brave of Hilary Yostik and Aisic himself, is that this family was a German family. So they did this in order to protect Aisic actually further, because who would think that a Jewish boy would try to hide in a German family's farm? So this family was living in Poland, and they're actually identified as Volksdeutsche, which means that they're false German. And that is because they had come over after World War I and just ended up staying in Poland. So the head of the family was actually deceased, and the wife, Marischka, was running the farm. She interviewed Aisic, and he made the cut, and so he got to stay on this farm and help around doing odd jobs on the farm. And he was actually there for about 2.5 years, all the way until the end of the war. And while he was there, Aisic would go to church every Sunday. And he remembers the town people thinking and saying about him, "Oh, he is such a devout and good Christian boy." And he did this to survive and to make sure that no one found out that he was a Jewish boy hiding with the German family.
I felt free. I tell you the truth, sometimes I forgot that I'm Jewish.
I personally think that this quote is so powerful because it shows that as a child, Aisic not only has family anymore, but he cannot live out his Jewish customs and traditions and religions that he was raised on, to the point that he forgot part of these customs. Now, while Aisic was at the farm, the war ends and Germany quits. And so they start to hear these rumors that the Russians are going to be coming in to Poland and specifically into Goshen. So the Frigis family, they're quite nervous because they know if the Russians come, it's not going to end up well for them. So they decide to flee the farm and just leave Aisic there on his own. They say, "Aisic, take care of the farm. Hopefully we'll see you soon." And they flee. So Aisic is in the farm when the Russians do arrive. And he was actually in danger himself because he was working on a German farm. So the Russians do not like him. They immediately abuse him, throw him into the cellar, and do not want anything to do with him because they think that he himself is German since he worked for a German family. Now eventually Aisic is able to convince one of the Russian officers, "Talk to me, I'll convince you that I actually am Jewish," because this Russian officer, was Jewish himself. So this is the account of what happened next.
"You Jewish? I'm Russian Jewish." So 2 Jews in the room. He says, "If you Jewish," he said to me, "you can only convince us if you drop your pants." "Why drop your pants?" "Well, before the war, and probably now too in Europe, every Jew that was born male was circumcised. So I was circumcised too." And all of a sudden he hugged me, he says he wants to adopt me, take me to Russia, he don't have kids.
So Aisic does not agree to be adopted. Again, he decides, I want to go back home. He wants to go back to where he was from. So he goes back to Mogielnica, and this is his 3rd time back. And he goes and decides to visit his old friends, those who had helped him before. So he first goes back to Stasic. Even though Stasic's son had betrayed him, he goes back to his father because he knew his father cared for him. And Stasic was amazed to see Aisic. He thought he was a ghost because he surely thought that he was no longer alive. And Aisic asked Stasic, "Oh, have you heard about Vladik?" The one who gave him a catechism book. And turns out Vladik was actually killed for his communistic ideas by the Germans. So Aisic could never go back and give him his thanks. Aisic also asked Stasic what is left of my Jewish community. Is there anyone left? And turns out there were 17 other survivors that had survived through this time from Mogielnica, and one of them was named Hana Anilevich. Now, Hana was actually one of Isaac's friends growing up. They knew each other, and she had taken a group of Jews to Israel. And this was when, it was then Palestine though. And this was when Isaac first got the idea, I could go to Palestine and there I could live. So he ends up not staying in Mogielnica because there was still hostility against the Jews there. And this is an interesting point of Isaac's story. All of the things that they had left behind, the Jews had left behind, were taken by the locals. And they did not want to give that stuff up once the Jews, those 17 survivors, returned. So they threatened Isaac and the other remaining Jews and told them they would kill them if he stayed. So Isaac had to leave. And he decides, I'm going to go to Palestine. So the process of going to Palestine would have been called Aliyah Bet. And this image is not a picture of Isaac on a boat, but it's very similar to what it would have looked like for Isaac to be on a boat with 1,000 other teenagers and children going to Palestine. Now, it took a long time for Isaac to get there. He had to go through many steps along the way in order to get the proper documentation in order to get there. So he goes from Mogielnica to Lodz, then to Czechoslovakia, then Vienna, then Linz, Hamburg, France, Egypt, and Palestine finally. Isaac specifically remembers in Egypt, they were docked there, and the locals threw stones at them and yelled at the Jewish boys that were coming over. So even after the war, this hostility continued, and they still had to experience this. Once Isaac entered Palestine, he came into the coastal town called Haifa. It's up in northern Palestine. And there he remained. He joined a kibbutz and actually fought for the Israeli War for Independence in 1948. And he fought alongside his friends, and he remembers the difference of fighting for a country to gain his independence, and how that was different from the experience he had in World War II, but still people died in both situations. And that was something that he took away from it. Isaac was actually injured in this war. He was shot in his leg. And while they were trying to bind him up, get him all fixed, a picture that Isaac had of his father, one single picture that he had carried with him throughout the whole war, was lost. So that one picture that we could have had did not make it. But Isaac did, which is the important thing. So Isaac then left the war and he decided to become a policeman. He trained for 6 to 7 months and then was a policeman for 11 years. And I love this photo because it shows even right after the war, as a policeman, Isaac is telling his story and he is teaching young people about what he has experienced. Here are other images of Isaac as a policeman. You can see this is his profile, and then we see him in silhouette right there. Now, while Isaac was a policeman, he loved visiting a certain restaurant because there was a certain beautiful lady working at this restaurant. Now, she was actually dating a fellow police officer, but he made a big mistake because he asked Isaac, who had a car, to drive his girlfriend, this waitress, home. And then she never went out with other policemen ever again. And this was Isaac's future wife, Riva. This is their wedding photo, and they were married on October 10th, 1950. And I love this photo because we see them as young, happy, in love couple. Here they are again as a couple. And here is their marriage certificate. So Isaac was a police officer, and he remembers after he married his beautiful bride that they lived with Riva's parents for a while. And this was a really big deal for Isaac because his parents had long been gone, and he remembers thinking to himself, I need to be with parents. This is really important for me. So they lived with Riva's parents for a while until the police officers offered Isaac and his wife an apartment in the neighborhood Kiryat Eliezer, up in the northernmost part of Haifa. Eventually, Isaac and Riva started a family, and they had a son, Chaim, who's Americanized name was Harold, who was born in 1955, and then a daughter, Cheryl, or her Hebrew name would have been Shulamit, who was born in 1958. So both Aisic and Riva had family in the United States, so they were starting to have conversations about coming to the United States. And Aisic specifically remembers thinking to himself, what do I have to lose? So they go. They immigrate over, and they do so because of his Uncle Max and Betty Lancer, his Uncle Max's daughter, writing letters of recommendation, promising that the Hirsch family would be a benefit to the United States of America. These letters brought them on May 1st through the 9th over the ship, the SS Atlantic. They came over in 1962. And we have their passenger cards. This is Aisic's, and this is Riva's. And once they came to the United States, they brought their family, and specifically to Brooklyn. And this is an image of Harold's bar mitzvah in the U.S. So as we said, they lived in Brooklyn. They lived in Brooklyn until the neighborhood started to change some, so they decided to move to Lakeland, New Jersey. And there Aisic worked in construction and provided and worked very hard for his family. And he also learned English throughout this time. Then later in 1990, Aisic was told by his son Harold, Dad, you can't get on roofs anymore. So they moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and Aisic became the clinical coordinator of Periodontal and Implant Associates, Inc., which his son owned. Aisic loved Birmingham. He loved being in the South, but he does remember that he had to learn Southern English at this point. And it was difficult because it's different from the English up north. Aisic never returned back home. He considered it at one point, but then he decided he should not. Here's his thoughts.
And my wife, said, no, it's no good to do that. So, you got to listen to the woman. That's why, I'm married for 63 years. You still look good.
So even though Aisic never did return to Poland, he continued to tell his story. He was a part of the Shoah organization that documented his testimony, and he even received a letter from Steven Spielberg thanking him for this interview. And this is the interview that we've been looking at clips of throughout this whole evening. Riva and Aisic joined a community within BHEC, and they were able to tell their story even more. In America, they were able to live out their Jewish customs and tradition with freedom. And this is my favorite image of them two together. I love their smiles on their face. But they told their story together, which is such a unique perspective. They told their stories in classrooms, and students were always so engaged by hearing their personal experiences throughout this time. Aisic passed away on March 7th, 2014, and he died peacefully in his sleep by his bride of 64 years. He was buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Birmingham. I feel like I've come to know Aisic, so it does hit a little bit. But Aisic's message is really important, and I think it's best to end this message with his own words.
The important thing is that I think what happened with the Germans shouldn't happen, never should happen in the world. All the free countries should do everything not to let one country to come to this point and to kill other people, innocent people and children, fathers and mothers, grandmothers, grandfathers. I hope in my generation, in the future generations, it's never going to happen. It was a horrible thing, horrible experience to go through. And for what? Just being a Jew.
So Aisic's story is one of hardship, but also one of hope. And as you have listened to me talking about Aisic and experiencing his life, you all, as Anne have said, have become a witness and can now go and share his story as you all leave this place. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Thanks. On his own 2 feet, honestly. When he was telling his story, he really remembers just walking, and that's all that he mentions in it. So definitely for that first time, right when he had left Warsaw Ghetto, he was just walking, and then he continued to walk to all of these places. They are somewhat close by, but not for walking. So it is amazing that he was able to travel all this way. Anything else? Well, thank you so much. And there are refreshments in the back, so you can continue to mingle and do all that.